Welcome back. This week, Republicans rolled out a new tax proposal that makes sweeping changes to the state's tax code. It rearranges the state's tax brackets. Instead of lumping people making between $28,000 and $315,000 in one bracket, moving anyone making less than $112,000, moving them to a lower bracket. Now, the plan would also include tax breaks for parents and retirees in Wisconsin. But what kind of impact will these tax cuts have for Wisconsinites and the Wisconsin economy? Joining us now is Ananth Seshadri, co-director of the Center for Research on the Wisconsin Economy at UW-Madison. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so first I want to kind of break apart some of these groups. Looking at the retirees, what would it mean for the state's economy to attract some of those groups?
And so at some level, you want to step back and look at what the impact of tax reform is going to be and why retirees potentially were targeted. So retirees are kind of an interesting group because at a fundamental level, they don't draw on very much in terms of state public subsidies because a lot of what they need is provided for by the federal government. And so they're an attractive group to try and retain in the state of Wisconsin and attract to the state of Wisconsin. So I suspect that this proposal will have an impact, will make a dent in terms of trying to attract and retain retirees in the state of Wisconsin.
Yeah, so you think of retirees, they have a lot to factor into. One of the analogies that they're using is choosing between Wisconsin and Florida. So you obviously have maybe the tax code, also the weather, some of those other quality of life issues. How much does some of those tax breaks impact somebody when they're thinking about where to resettle, for example?
Sure. When you look at migration decisions, right, it's not an easy economic question to kind of study, but recently people have looked at one kind of clean, stark example, which is the state of California. That raised tax rates fairly substantially over the last decade or so. And you actually saw significant outmigration from the state of California to lower tax states, right? So this is not just retirees, these are workers. And so that's one clean example where substantial increases in tax rates actually led to outmigration from the state to another state.
And I'm fascinated too, one of the other groups that was pulled out were these parents giving them tax cuts, essentially allowing more child care costs to be deducted from this federal qualifying list, essentially. Sure. Are parents another one of those groups that are kind of specifically important to economic driving?
So married couples especially sound like a very interesting group to me for the following reason. When you go around the state, you hear a lot about the labor force shortage in the state of Wisconsin. And one group that's being targeted by this tax reform is our married women, right? So you have, and if you think about what might be an inhibiting factor from more women working in the labor force, I would think of two things. One is potentially the marriage tax penalty, and the other is the cost of childcare, which right now it's actually about 30% more expensive than UW-Madison tuition. And so the two provisions in this bill would, to some degree, alleviate both the marriage tax penalty and the child care credit. And my understanding is that the marriage tax credit existed for a long period of time in the state of Wisconsin, and all this bill does is adjust for inflation over the last 15 to 20 years or so.
That's a good point, too, because part of this bill would be to give that tax break specifically to married couples as well. So with these changes to the tax bracket, what I was mentioning before, that like 28 to more than 300,000 a single filer income, that seems to be a huge bracket for a person who's not necessarily an economic policy expert like myself. Does that compare? Is that comparable to how other states kind of arrange their local income taxes?
So it's interesting to compare Wisconsin's degree of progressivity of tax structure with other states. If you look over the last 2 decades or so, in the state of Wisconsin, our degree of progressivity, so one way to look at this is to look at what happens to the top bracket vis-a-vis the bottom bracket, and our rate of progressivity defined by, say the top bracket minus the bottom bracket tax rate has doubled by a little more than, has more than doubled. So it's gone from like 2 percentage points to almost like 4.15 percentage points. And so what this means is our tax structure has become more progressive. States around us, and most of the states in America have actually reduced their degree of progressivity and moved slowly to a flatter tax structure. All right, and so it's also interesting if you compare the retiree tax credit with some of our neighbors like Illinois and Iowa that exempt retiree income taxes. So at some level, it's not just trying to get the economic incentives right, but also trying to make sure that we compete with other states in order to make sure that we can attract and retain and provide the right incentives for people to work, save, and live here.
So that issue of progressivity, that's kind of fascinating to me too. Does that compare to the federal income tax, for example? You think of that as being generally rather progressive?
Yes. So the federal income tax structure is progressive. And one can debate the merits of whether or not a progressive tax structure is efficient. What a progressive tax structure seeks to do are two things, which is inherently what a state government tries to do, right? A state essentially tries to collect resources, collects tax revenue in the most efficient way possible. And then it attempts to provide insurance for individuals who are not so fortunate, right? By taxing the rich and giving it to the poor, taxing, let's say, the lucky and giving it to the not so lucky. And the progressive tax structure attempts to do both with one blunt instrument. And so this is potentially the reason why a lot of states have moved away from a progressive tax structure to a flat tax structure, because it has a little bit better economic incentives.
One of the other things that we talk about is this idea of the state surplus, kind of one-time money that the state has collected more than it has dispersed. It's sitting at about $4 billion for the state of Wisconsin, and part of the political efforts would be to spend down that budget surplus with these tax breaks. But that's not necessarily, that'll exist for just this budget cycle. It won't exist much beyond that. Some of these tax breaks might be permanent. Is there a sustainability issue when we start giving some of these tax breaks back that would, sacrifice taking back in some of that revenue?
Sure, that's a good question to ask. It's not shocking that most states contemplate tax reform when at a time when the economy has a lot of surplus. So, which is the reason why I think Wisconsin is contemplating a major tax reform at a time like this. There is no question that in the longer run, and the Legislative Fiscal Bureau has some numbers on what the impact will be of this tax change on effectively state government resources, tax collections, right? But I think that's not necessarily the only metric or necessarily the right metric to look at, because at the end of the day, we want to know whether this tax change, in fact, how does it influence standards of living? How does it influence consumption, GDP, and so on? And when you think about states' economy, it's not just government outlays, but it's also private consumption and investment. So if it's the case that the tax reform ends up increasing GDP, increasing consumption and investment by more than the state government expenditure goes down, then it's on net, on balance, it's a good thing for the state.
Okay, can I ask you then, peer into your crystal ball a little bit, it's easy, I think, to kind of, dollars and cents it a little bit. For some of those other characteristics, some of those other factors, do you have a sense of how these might impact that?
So this is something we are working on. We'll probably release a report sometime next week. But our early estimates suggest that the Legislative Fiscal Bureau does a static analysis where they conclude that in the longer run, this bill will reduce government expenditures by about $1.4 billion. So these are the four different components: the middle class tax credit, middle class tax cut, the retiree income tax cut, and then the two provisions for the marriage credit and then the child care credit. So all told, that's about $1.4 billion. So our best estimate at this point in time, and we'll fine tune that over the next few days or so, is that when you move from the economy we're in right now and you make the changes that are in the bill, it would increase Wisconsin state GDP by at least $2.5 billion.
Wow, so net positive.
A net positive.
Anyway. Fascinating. Yeah, Professor Seshadri, thanks so much for joining us. We'll be right back after this.